Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the Psychedelic Insider Series, fireside chats with industry leaders in the psychedelic space.
All right, so we're having a few more attendees trickle in, guys. Welcome. James and I are just sort of having a little bit of small chat before we really dive into the conversation. We'll probably wait 3 more minutes just to make sure that we have a bit of a full house, and then we'll get going. James, just to start things off, I would love if we could, just like start with a little bit of an introduction about your name and your background, and sort of a little bit about the company that you started in the psychedelic space. And if we could just start with that as a framework and a context, then as more participants come in, I'll sort of bring those things back up and sort of integrate that into our conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That makes sense. My name is James Lanthier, and I'm the CEO of a business called Mindset Pharma. So Mindset is a drug discovery business focused on developing new, or fancier word, novel psychedelics, psychedelic medicines. So we sit on the medical side of kind of the divide in the, I guess, if you will, in the industry. Mm-hmm. That's where, we think that the biggest opportunity is. Before I helped start this business, my career has been in helping technology enabled businesses grow from something small to something bigger, in some cases quite a bit bigger. But recently, the last business I helped start, which is before Mindset, was a business that applied artificial intelligence to the variables of human fertility. So that kind of took me into healthcare technology. But when I found out about what the Mindset team was up to, as big an opportunity as infertility is, and as heartbreaking as it is, the opportunity to help people with psychedelics and help push the adoption of psychedelic medicines forward, to me was just an unbeatable combination. I'm not only a believer in cognitive liberty, but I have, when we're talking about the medical applications of psychedelics, I've had people who are very close to me, who've had profound breakthroughs in their lives through the use of psychedelics. And if you think of kind of the range of neuropsychiatric indications that psychedelic medications can be used for, whether that's depression or PTSD, or end of life cancer, existential angst. I mean, sadly, who hasn't lost a loved one to cancer, or who hasn't had one of their friends go through paralyzing depression. So these are, if you can help people in any one of these categories, help large groups of people in these categories, you're involved with a very good thing. So it was very appealing to me to get involved.
And how long have you been involved now? Like, what is that run up and that process been like for you with Mindset Pharma?
Yeah, so I've been involved since the beginning of the year. The company itself is probably just around about a year old. The initial sort of scientific work was and the drafting of kind of the intellectual property that was done in kind of the latter half of last year. Those patent applications got filed at the beginning of this year, and that's when I got involved.
Now I think I'm just gonna go into an interesting question at this point in time, which is the relationship between mental health and infertility. And considering how you had a background in running an infertility, you know, and doing things like that, have you picked up on any interesting sort of connections between the work that you're starting to do with Mindset Pharma and maybe some of the things that you had previously discovered in terms of what would lead to infertility as it was related to depression or anxiety or some of these other mental health issues?
Right. So great question. I wouldn't say, you know, we've picked up on anything, you know, scientifically, but certainly, you know, mindset and, you know, state of mind, you know, plays, I think if you ask, you know, any fertility doctor, you know, they'll all tell you it plays, you know, an enormous role in the infertility process. These things go, you know, hand in hand. You know, if you know people who've you know struggled to have a child when, you know, that was their goal, it is really an enormously, you know, emotionally, physically, you know, taxing experience and you know, quite, you know, financially draining as well. So it's definitely an area where people are looking for, you know, any amount of help that they can get.
So let's kind of go back into a few of the brass tacks with Mindset Pharma. You know, if you were to describe to the participants today and, you know, maybe anyone else who is listening to this, sort of like, what is it that Mindset Pharma does? So what's the business model behind Mindset Pharma? What problem are you hoping to solve? How would you explain that to kind of the average everyday person who maybe is just becoming interested in psychedelic medicine?
Right. So I think the best analogy, you know, that describes what we're trying to do, is, and it's a pretty simple one, but if you look back at what aspirin became, or where aspirin came from. So, you know, a critical, you know, one of the top selling drugs of all time, and you know, a huge leap forward in you know, the management of pain. You go back to you know, the ancient Egyptian times. You know, you'll find references to people using the bark of consuming the bark of the willow tree. You go to the ancient Greeks, they're writing about, you know, Hippocrates is writing about, you know, feeding people tea based on the bark of the willow tree, you know, and to alleviate pain, and you know, people are you know, puking their guts out drinking this stuff, but there's no other real way to manage your pain. So it's a, you know, kind of an acceptable trade-off.
Opium was also popular. It's funny that you mentioned that. I just read a book, which is actually right here. It's called The Chemical Muse, Ancient or Drug Use and the Roots of Western Civilization. And it talks about willow bark, and it talks about
cool,
opium as well, and how extensively widely it was used.
Oh, that's cool. I'll have to check. If you can send me that afterwards,
I will do that.
I'd love to check that out.
I will do that.
But look, you know, you get to the 19th century, then finally the science starts to catch up, and you have, you know, these French and German chemists trying to, you know, get at the answer to the question of why and how does the bark of the willow tree, you know, alleviate people's pain. And they go through all these iterations of salicin to then salicylic acid, and all this, you know, trial and error, as they try to kind of advance the compounds that are from the willow tree to try to, you know, create a medicine, to finally, you know, acetylsilic acid, which is, you know, in 1900, you know, the year 1900 is patented by Bayer and is, you know, branded as aspirin. You know, I guess the analogy that we like to use is that, you know, if you had a headache, you wouldn't go out and chew on the bark of a willow tree. to get at the acid, you'd take an aspirin. There's been, tremendous. Most of us, yeah.
There'll be a few weirdos, but yeah.
There's been all this great, foundational research, right, in the last 20 years by these not-for-profit groups who really took their cues from what, various indigenous cultures have known for a long time about these substances. And they've established the therapeutic benefit of psilocybin mushrooms and so on. But what we're trying to do here really is to create an aspirin for mental health, right? So we're trying to take something that now science has pretty irrefutably shown is exceptional for treating these different afflictions, and we're trying to turn it into something that is more optimized as a pharmaceutical that works for the largest possible population groups in a as close to a similar way as possible. People are probably not going to take in the future. They're probably not going to take mushrooms for their depression, because there's no way that you can the dose of psilocybin that you're going to get is going to vary quite wildly. They're probably not even going to take psilocybin because psilocybin has certain limitations and drawbacks. They're going to take a drug that's based on psilocybin, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create that drug that works for as big a population group as possible.
It will be based on psilocybin as a tryptamine, or not necessarily? Could it be a lisergamide, or could it be
No. So the initial family of compounds that we've started with are based on are, I guess, broadly inspired by psilocybin. That's what we say. The other thing that we're, I guess, addressing and that we thought was really an opportunity is that because most of the scientific work that had gone on in the space, it had really gone into either establishing that the drugs are useful, and that they're relatively safe and relatively non-addictive, or more recently it had gone into formulations. Relatively little work had actually done what you do in modern pharmacy, which is take a drug and see if you can or take a compound or a structure and see if you can make it better based on your knowledge of what it is that you want it to do, which in this case is you want it to act on the 5-HT2A receptor, and you want it to create the psychedelic effect, but ideally you want it to do so with fewer metabolites, so it's a more targeted drug.
So I love the commonalities that you explained between the willow bark and aspirin, and how we're essentially trying to do something similar with, we could say, psilocybin mushrooms and psilocybin-like compounds, maybe a 4-ACO-DMT or whatever it is. So I understand that commonality. I'd love to hear you go deeper into what are the differences, though, that you see between those two analogies. So clearly, treating pain is different than treating mental health issues. So what to you are sort of like, commonalities are clear, but what are some of those differences?
Well, for the folks who are familiar with the space and which is more and more people every day, and familiar with the research, I think one clear difference is in the clinical model that's being envisioned, or the dosage model that's being envisioned so far. You don't take an aspirin once to cure your pain for the next 12 months. You take an aspirin as long as the pain from your sprained ankle lasts, and then you take another one in 6 hours or whatever. That's based on the research that we're seeing so far. That's unlikely to be the case with psilocybin based medicines. You're likely going to take a significant dose and have the psychedelic experience. And there's going to be, a therapeutic aspect of it as well. That's going to be, absolutely critical to getting the benefits from it. So there's obviously big differences in how these drugs will be taken and how they'll be, administered.
Well, and I think to kind of go deeper into those commonalities, you could even say that microdoses of psilocybin could be comparable to aspirin, because,
Yep.
if you have pain and you're taking an aspirin to deal with that pain and sort of suppress that pain, there could be a similar, and again, there's not a lot of research on this. We have a lot more clinical
Right.
research on the efficacy of high doses of psilocybin
Right.
and the efficacy of MDMA. The microdosing research is still in its infancy. And from anecdotal reports and whatnot, it looks like, the microdose element is more of a typical pharmaceutical approach, we could say, whereas the high dose psilocybin experience sort of turns the pharmaceutical approach on its head, because
It does.
it's less about this pill will fix you, and more about this pill will create an opening through which you can integrate new ways of being that will help to heal underlying issues that are related to the depression or addiction. It could be adverse childhood experiences. It could be,
Yep.
emotional trauma. It could be, sexual assault, whatever it is.
That's very well. Wow, that's very well said. I think the microdosing research, as you said, it's kind of early days. We haven't really seen yet clear evidence that it works. Lots of anecdotal, lots of, I guess, anecdotal, if you can call it evidence, but anecdotes that to support the idea that it's beneficial to people. But again, a very different experience than the macrodose with therapy to help you unpack all that difficult stuff in your past.
Exactly. Do you have any personal experience with psychedelics? Is that something that you publicly talk about, or how do you handle that, challenge? Because I know there are some researchers and scientists who don't publicly talk about, if they've had experience. I know, it's still a sensitive topic, so I like to be respectful of that, but
I don't really get into the specifics, only because they're relatively trivial, but yeah, absolutely. I've had experiences with psychedelics, and I'm fortunate that I don't think I carry a lot of unresolved trauma with me through through my life, but I've always felt them to be all of those experiences I've had to be, incredibly beneficial to me and very, very special to me in a way that I think this is probably, I'm not sure this is the case with everyone, but it's almost hard to articulate why, but
sure.
They're very important to me.
Ineffable.
Ineffable. Great word.
Ineffability of psychedelics. So then diving back into some brass tacks with Mindset Pharma and sort of your approach, there's a lot of interesting and novel compounds that have been written about over the last 30 to 40 years. So in particular, Alexander Shulgin, who wrote Pikal and Tikal, explored probably the most of anyone. And so I know that there are companies that are exploring 2CI and a lot of the 2C chemicals. I know, there are more and more companies who are looking at, different lysergamides that could be useful, although they're a bit trickier to work with because they're longer lasting in some cases. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from your perspective. Why is it that you're choosing psilocybin-like compounds?
Mm-hmm.
And what process do you go through as a company to determine which ones you will pursue from a drug discovery perspective?
Right. So I think psilocybin-inspired compounds really were the natural, place for us to start, because of the amount of, of clinical research that's out there, supporting their efficacy and the high probability that they're going to be that psilocybin is going to be formally approved in the short to medium term, we'll call it, by the FDA.
We hope.
Yeah, so that's why we started there. The science on our end, and really the brains behind the operation, are two principal scientists. So our medicinal chemist, Malik Slossi, who has quite a large patent portfolio to his name, a real expertise in looking at established compounds and figuring out ways to improve them through redesigning them. The other side of our scientific team is Joseph Arujo. Joseph, in his day job, he's the CEO and the founder of a business called Intervivo Solutions, which is a top kind of boutique animal testing CRO. So with a specialty on central nervous system drugs, and Malik has created hundreds of patentable compounds that have made some of which that have made their way to the market in different drug classes. Joe has seen and worked for the who's who of big pharma and has seen multiple different methodologies for successful and unsuccessful drug development. And the idea really started with them, and they felt that there were some opportunities to apply some techniques that they'd used before and seen before in their past to create something not only that was new, but that could create a more targeted drug. And they felt that through some adaptions of the chemical structure, you could potentially get to a drug that would have a more similar half-life for a larger population group. So that's really that's why we've started where we have. There's no question, like we've only just begun, and I don't mean that just mindset, but like the space in general. There's a huge universe of psychedelics and other compounds and other potential analogs and derivatives, and I hope that the industry just grows and we see more and more research into them, because who's to say that there isn't something much better than the drugs that have already been studied and are well understood. There could be other stuff out there that solves problems we haven't even considered could be solved by psychedelics. But the goal was to start with something that where there was clinical data to support its utility, and that really is psilocybin and MDMA, and to see if we could create something that was better, and based on our preliminary results that we're getting so far in our preclinical work, we are getting that feedback that what we've designed is quite potent.
If you have any free samples that you can send.
If I had a nickel for every time.
Yeah. Oh man, it's because I do have a foot in the very medical space. I'm very aware of what's going on with Atai and Compass and Mindset Pharma, and that. But also I'm very aware of the underground stuff that's going on. It's really interesting, especially like some very, very high level underground stuff that's going on.
Sure.
It's really interesting to see the number of compounds that aren't really known that much. So both, like people identify psilocybin and MDMA, but a lot of people might not be familiar with like the 2CI or the 4-ACO DMT or the ALD52, or, like I could keep going with some of these novel compounds.
Yeah.
And just as a lot of people are familiar with maybe San Pedro and peyote and ayahuasca, there's also a lot of other plant medicines. Kana is one. There are several that aren't as well known. So I think what you're doing with Mindset Pharma in terms of, and what you've already talked about, like the more light and awareness that we can bring to the interaction between the human body and these exogenous compounds, and then how that plays and interacts with our entire system. Like you were saying, we have a lot of research on the efficacy of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and end-of-life anxiety. And we don't have a lot of research on the efficacy of, psilocybin for inflammatory diseases. Now, Eleusis is doing that research with LSD. And that's a huge sort of understudied area of the psychedelic renaissance that still remains to be covered. So, when it comes to the plans for Mindset Pharma, right, you're focused on the preclinical with this novel compound at the moment. When you look at the next 3 to 5 years, do you see that portfolio expanding? Are you staying very focused on just one compound at a time? How do you see sort of, your mission evolving over the next several years?
Right. So I guess in addition to the first, family of compounds that we've, filed these patent applications on and are advancing through the preclinical steps, as our scientists have spent more and more time in the space, they've really uncovered, more and more potential, innovations. So we're expecting to make some more filings on another composition of matter patent application on a different psychedelic. But the other thing that we're pretty excited about that they'll kill me if I say too much about, so I can really only talk about it
say
in
as much as possible,
general terms, but is a manufacturing process to synthesize a very well-known psychedelic that we feel is, based on all the data we've gotten so far, we think it could represent a major leap forward for the economic and scalable production of that compound. And it's a compound that everybody's studying and everybody is going to want to have access to. So we'll hopefully be ready to say a little bit more about that in a few weeks, but that's another initiative that we're working on. I think if you look down, if I look, that's sort of next 6 month stuff. If you look, that's all a lot. That's really 3 different directions we're headed in. But I think that that's just an indication of how much opportunity there is in the upfront IP development field in psychedelics, because so much of the work has gone into so much of the work so far by the different not-for-profit groups really has gone towards kind of winning over the regulators and the scientific community to the benefits at a high level of these substances, and that's been critically important work. And you see it now turning like the tide of public opinion, which is great. But there's a bit of there's a lot of open field for groups to advance all these work on all these other compounds. And we have a few ideas in that regard, but we've got a lot on our plate with this stuff right now.
Let's dive a little bit into, I want to pick my words correctly, kind of the relationship between psychedelics and cannabis. So, as a Canadian, you're probably at least fairly familiar with the cannabis industry.
Sure.
from your perspective, what went well and what didn't go so well? And comment as little or as much as you wish. And how can the psychedelic space in Canada maybe learn from some of those challenges or issues or mistakes, or maybe not if they're not relevant to the psychedelic space, in terms of how they're developing a medical framework for psychedelic substances?
Well, I guess the two spaces really are they're two very different categories, right? So it's I guess it's probably because the medical applications of cannabis are relative, I think what we're going to see in psychedelics is a medical market, and hopefully there's a legal recreational market at some point, but we can really only plan for a medical market. Cannabis is really mostly recreational, but I think there's if you look at them from a business standpoint, obviously the leaders in cannabis did a tremendous job of attracting a lot of capital and a lot of investor interest to the space. They helped create a real market, and it may have disappointed investors, but I'm not sure that that's really the fault of the entrepreneurs. It's now a giant market. It's a little bit disappointing in cannabis to see that as I guess that Canada kind of missed the window to create true independent global leaders. Canopy sold out. Good for them and their shareholders, but they sold out relatively early, and there for sure was an opportunity to create a giant true global cannabis leader that was a Canadian company. But but good for them and their shareholders, but this is a pattern in Canada, right? Like we had the first smartphone, we could have been the leaders, and now we're not. So
yeah,
it's not.
Was that Nokia?
No, BlackBerry.
Oh, you were BlackBerry. Wow.
Yeah, research.
There are some good things that come out of Canada.
It was a Canadian company, so
besides South Park.
Right. Yeah. So as far, yeah, I think more power to the public companies in Canada that are attracting capital and are growing their market caps, and I think they'll be capital is really critical to these. I think it's going to be critical in psychedelics, just like it was in cannabis, and I think it's great that they're attracting capital. Hopefully they don't sell out too early.
Well, and I think the main distinction as well is, cannabis was so much of a focus on the whole flower, whereas specifically with what Mindset Pharma is working on and a number of other organizations, it's much more about the molecule rather than the flower. And I think that also brings up, interesting questions around, this hasn't happened in Canada yet, which I'm surprised by, but, the decrim movement that's currently happening in the United States. And
right.
And so that, I think, is the really interesting dichotomy in the psychedelic space. Is it won't be a matter of one winning versus the other. They will support one another in various ways, but it will be interesting to see how psychedelic medicine is adopted through normal institutional channels, the FDA, psychiatric institutions and hospitals, compared to more grassroots sort of community focused organizations that focus on whole plants rather than the novel compounds.
Yeah. And I don't know I think the two can really go hand in hand. I think the fact that you have, all this research and all this work going on the compounds, I think that, and at, top research institutions, Johns Hopkins, NYU, kind of you name it. I think actually that will help the grassroots plant-based side, because it's the compound research that will kind of continue to move the needle with the FDA. And we're still very much living, in the shadow of kind of what Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan did to stigmatize these drugs by lumping them in with all these other scheduled drugs that are, really have no benefit to anybody. Right. And we know that psychedelics are really a totally different animal, but there's huge groups of the population that still thinks of them as sitting under that umbrella. So I think the decriminalization movements probably help move the FDA a little bit, because they don't live in a vacuum and they can see the evolution of public opinion. But I think also the science will help the grassroots as well. That's my optimistic way of looking at things.
Yeah, my pessimistic way of looking at things is Donald Trump becomes a dictator, and then FDA approval really doesn't matter so much. And so I think that's also my concern with some of the overfocus on the medical model is you're putting trust in institutions that in the past haven't been so trustworthy. And although science does prove things, it's very clear that a lot of institutions, although we'd like to think they make decisions based on science, that's not always the case. So fingers crossed. I think Rick Doblin in a most recent Forbes article said MDMA would be available by 2023. And it looks like psilocybin will be soon after that. It could be likely that based on, I think, license 56 in Canada, that becomes much, that these compounds become available much sooner in Canada than the United States, which means I would move to Vancouver potentially, we could see a bit of an immigration or emigration that way. Yeah. But regardless of all of those things, based on your current framework, based on how you see, the pharmaceutical industry, Mindset Pharma, with some of your past work in healthcare. And again, it seems like all bets are off the table with COVID and all these protests and riots. So it's a little hard to predict things at this point in time. But, if you had to say with a 50,000-foot view, where do you see the industry headed in the next 5 to 10 years? If this industry were really to serve humanity in the most efficacious and inspiring way possible, how can that happen?
Well, I mean, I think you're going to see. I mean, I guess you already are seeing it, with Johnson and Johnson, but you're going to see. I'm just such a believer in what the science has shown already, that I think you're going to see the major pharma companies move into the space. And once one does, they all will, because you take any one of these, indications, and they're, multi-billion-dollar markets. Will something get lost along the way? There's a very good chance something, will, and it won't quite be the future that we're hoping for. It never is, but on the margins, you'll have drugs in the marketplace that do a drastically better job of solving these problems or addressing these problems for people. And people with depression take their lives every day. These deaths are potentially avertable with the help of these drugs. I mean, not all of them, but some of them, and that's that's critically important.
Yeah, it is. And I think my hope is that we don't lose sight of, we were talking about this at the beginning of the conversation, that we don't lose sight of the indigenous wisdom that has come with these tools for thousands and thousands of years, because as you hinted at, I think an unfortunate consequence of pharmaceutical companies coming into this industry is then they become, psychedelics become sort of swallowed by the great white shark in the economic issue. And so it becomes less about healing and more about profit. And it feels like, and actually MAPS has been explicit about this. This is why MAPS and Hefter and USONA have chosen the nonprofit route in particular, because again, and I think this is a very American phenomenon. I don't think this applies to Europe necessarily, or not as much to Canada, but it's an American phenomenon. It sort of protects the industry from profiteering by maybe less savory characters, if you will.
Right.
Because the critical component of psychedelics, as we all know, is set and setting. So you can take a compound or a molecule and have a breakthrough experience, but if you come back into your same lifestyle as before with the same relationships and the same habits and the same everything, you're unlikely to actually see long-term improvements in things like depression, because depression is not just biochemical, but it has to do with our social and economic and other factors as well.
Yeah. Well, and this is where the therapeutic, the treatment side of it is going to be, critically important. And maybe that's, for pharma companies to somehow, embrace indigenous knowledge is probably, a stretch, but there probably is an element or aspect of indigenous culture knowledge that hopefully will get, included in the knowledge around how you best, as a therapist, how you best support someone, integrate the psychedelic experience into their life in a positive way that allows them some relief. And I think that's probably where that'll play out. Hopefully. Time
will tell. Time will tell. So we have about 10, 15 minutes left, James. And usually at the end of these, we just allow some questions to come up, because we do have 10 attendees. So attendees, now is the time that if you have any questions about Mindset Pharma. Oh, hi, Luke. I have a friend who's here. Good to see you, Luke. So if you have any questions that are about Mindset Pharma or are about, the novel drug compounds that they're discovering or anything related to James's position and job, now is a great time to drop those questions in. And then, once we know those questions, we'll go from there. We'll see. We'll give it a few seconds. And if there aren't any questions, then I have a few more questions, James, that we can get into. So I'll okay, good. So Luke asks the first question, which is Mindset Pharma only concentrating on psilocybin related compounds, or are you also looking at MDMA related compounds?
No, at the moment we're only focused on psilocybin inspired compounds. We're planning on getting to MDMA, but we've started with psilocybin based compounds.
And what clinical diagnoses are you exploring with those compounds? Have you gotten to that stage yet where you're looking at like treatment resistant depression or addiction, or is it more preclinical about?
It's all preclinical. So it's the same set of the same kind of range of unfortunate afflictions that everybody else looks at. We think there's some interesting potential, I won't call them niches, but there are some additional interesting indications that we think, folks aren't looking at. We're hoping to partner with some people with the right clinical infrastructure to look at those. But at a high level, it's the same things. It's treatment resistant depression, anxiety, those kinds of things.
So next question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you see any potential for psychedelic drugs that do not produce psychedelic effects? So one example would probably be MC18, which is what MindMed is working on.
Right. These drugs are so strong that's entirely possible, but that hasn't been our approach. We're not trying to design drugs that minimize the psychedelic effect, for the simple reason that the research, so far shows that you need the psychedelic effect to get the clinical benefits.
I'm in agreement with that. I think the neutering of psychedelic compounds, I mean, I understand the importance of exploring all angles and exploring all elements, and that's critically important. And I think there is a concern that neutering these could lead to less beneficial effects, which could lead to maybe not so great media attention on that.
Yeah.
So the next question is from another anonymous attendee. So who asks, aside from your own company, Mindset Pharma, which company's work in the psychedelic space interests you most?
Well, look, I think there is a lot of work to be done on building out the right clinical infrastructure and model. So I'm going to be really interested to see what Field Trip does and Champignon over the next little while. I think there's great opportunities there. But I think obviously we watch closely what Atai and what Compass are up to. I think the scientific team at Gilgamesh, which is a company that Atai is involved in, are quite it's quite a strong scientific team. So and I think what they've worked on so far has been pretty promising. I probably pay less attention to the businesses that are focused on kind of the recreational side or consumer businesses, like the functional mushrooms and that kind of stuff, just because I find the drug development science stuff more interesting. And I think that is going to be a bigger, not that people won't be using functional mushrooms, but I think that's going to be a bigger opportunity.
Although microdosing supplements, I think, could be a billion dollar industry, and that will be partly medical and partly recreational. But I agree with you. At least in the short term, I think drug development and drug discovery will be, especially for all these novel compounds, super important.
Yeah.
The next question comes from Daniel. So if and when certain psychedelics become legal, will Mindset Pharma focus, are you focused exclusively on the medical market as a company, or is there an opportunity to also, integrate, the legal recreational market if that's the case?
Look, if we snap our fingers and put ourselves into an alternate universe where all of a sudden
Joe Rogan for president, I think
right,
that's the alternate universe,
right? Then I think there's no reason that the compounds that we've worked on wouldn't be just as applicable in that scenario. We just find that to be despite all the decriminalization and efforts and all that stuff, I think that's probably, I'm hopeful, but I think that's probably a very long way off, if ever.
Yeah, I agree. Next question comes from anonymous attendee. Are you looking at MAOI presence in your psilocybin formulations?
Well, I can't get too detailed. We filed our provisional patent applications earlier in the year, and so I've probably said what I can say about our compounds.
Any other questions for James? Lanthier, is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah.
Very French.
It's true.
How's fundraising going? Asks Luke.
Fine. We raised some money internally when I got involved, really, and from a few friends. So we're not like any other company in the space, we're watching what's going on in the public market, and we're talking to folks, but we're not actively raising money at the moment because we don't need to.
And how big is your team at Mindset Pharma?
We're 4 people.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have your 2 partners who are the more scientific, and then you as the CEO.
Yeah. And another one of the other sort of business co-founders.
Very cool. Good.
Mm-hmm.
And what's sort of your roadmap for the next 6 months as a business?
The next 6 months is, continue to advance the compounds through the preclinical work. We think actually based on some of the recent results, we can get pretty quickly down to a smaller group that we're going to take into some in vivo testing in animals over the next few months, and ideally get to a lead compound by the end of the year, and make some of the other intellectual property filings that I kind of alluded to over the next few months.
Very cool. And then the last question, unless we have one more, comes from James, which is a bit of a tangent, but it's a great question. What is your view of the recent RTOs in the psychedelic space? MindMed had an RTO of, I think, a gold mining company, and Numinous had an RTO to go on public venture. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think that's the same pathway that cannabis took. And, I think there's a lot of the interest in the space is really, is warranted. I'm biased, but I think that this is going to be, quite a large market ultimately. As you might have detected, I'm a bit more skeptical about some of the more kind of consumer facing businesses. And, so, it's like any period of market enthusiasm, not all the businesses are going to work out, but I think there's some very good, there's some very good companies in there. And, the RTO pathway, it's less familiar to folks outside of outside of Canada. But it is a very real way to raise capital, and there is this class of investors in Canada who have a lot of appetite for supporting early stage companies. So there's lots of other markets in the world where you wouldn't find companies at such an early stage getting to the public markets, but there've been great companies that have come out of it. So I think it's great.
It's just another way to sort of spin.
It's just another way to access. It's another way to access capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the market's supportive, then being in a public company, if the market's supportive, is a great place to be. So you just hope that the enthusiasm kind of continues, because a lot of the companies that are coming to market now will probably need to continue to raise funds to support their business plans, and so you just hope the market enthusiasm continues, and I think it should, because there's going to continue to be great scientific developments and advancements, and the FDA will move closer and closer to the acceptance. So I think it should continue, and the public interest should keep up.
Last question is from Daniel Hoover, who asks about with these novel compounds that you're developing that have fewer metabolites, as you mentioned. How does that compare to eating whole mushrooms in terms of the onset and potential nausea of whole mushrooms compared to these novel compounds?
We think there should be less nausea, but we don't know this yet for sure. We won't be able to confirm that until we get into some of the obviously the human tests. But we think it should be less nauseating.
Yeah, I wonder what the nausea is tied to, if it's related to serotonergic activity in the gut. I think that's my intuition. So I wonder if you have something that's less serotonergic, if it would be less nauseating. But it's hard to say because
we'll see.
We don't know a lot. Yeah, totally. Great. All right. Well, James, I want to thank you for sitting down on 7 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. I'm sure, like many other startups in this space, you've been hard at work. So I appreciate you sitting down with us and chatting. Any last thoughts or ideas or questions or anything else that you want to share with our audience before we get going?
Like I said, I want to really thank everybody who took the time to listen. And Paul, I really want to thank you for, for taking the time to talk to me. And I really enjoyed our conversation. If anybody has any other questions or wants to connect, just send us a message through the website. We love talking to everybody in the space. We've always got time to talk to folks. So happy to talk to folks, anyone who's interested.
Great. Well, James, thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
You too. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining the Psychedelic Insider series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.